So when you're looking over the cut list, this probably doesn't make a lot of sense at first. You're going to see the parts are 3/4 inch, so the sides. Right now I'm just really talking about the sides, but 3/4 inch thick, but then I have a big chunk of 8/4 material, so 2-inch thick material, nominal. So I'm just going to explain this technique a little bit for people that are not familiarized with this technique. So this is called rip and flip. So basically you're looking at the wood a little bit different. So this 8/4 inch this 8/4 board is a plain sawn board. And so what that means is when you look at the end of this board, you see the annual rings. So this side was the outside of the tree. And so within this section, within this board itself, you're going to have, like through here, where these annual rings are going almost at a 45 and towards the outside here, 45, you're going to have this very, so rift sawn, it's going to be very straight grain. And what that means is if you look down this edge here, it's got nice straight grain here. If you look down this edge too, it's going to be straight grain, straight grain. So all four faces will be straight grain. So it's really important when you start a project to think about the wood. A lot of times people get caught up in technique and forget about wood selection, which really can make or break a piece. If you just spend a little bit of time being thoughtful about the wood selection, it makes a huge difference. And again, I'm saying this with my aesthetic. You may hate the look of this. You may say, oh, it looks like plywood, Phil. It kind of does, because it looks kind of like veneer. But that's kind of what I like the look of, and the reason for that is it really doesn't fight with the overall piece. So the lines of the piece really pop, and it just, it accents that. So the rip and flip, we'll use this 8/4 board. I'm basically going to go over to the bandsaw. 3/4 inch is the final thickness of this panel. So I'm not going to go to the bandsaw and set up at 3/4 inch. I'm going to go and set it up at 7/8. So that way when I mill it up later on, I can get my 3/4 inch. A bit of common sense comes into play here too. Go ahead, an 1/8 inch is more than enough. It should be. But go ahead and you set it up, you rip your first piece off. If for some reason that piece just goes crazy, then you need to adjust. You need to just make that decision. Is this going to clean up? If it just goes absolutely crazy, you might not want to use that board. Maybe there's a lot of tension within that piece. So this is kiln dried ash, so it should be pretty stable. But I'll go over, 7/8, and I'm just going to rip it. So on the bandsaw, I'm not going to go back and forth to the joiner. You can do that. To me, it's a bit of a waste of time. The only time I'll go back to the joiner is if this piece of wood, because when you're ripping the wood, that's when it wants to move. Cross-cutting it doesn't do anything. When you rip it, that's the tension within this board and it wants to do its thing. So if it starts getting a bit away from me, I'll go back and address the blank on the joiner and then go back and continue ripping and flipping. But yeah, it's just ripping these pieces out. Now, you will get a bit of a different look, and this is where I don't get too crazy about it. So through here, it's going to be like this very rift sawn, and then it's going to get into quarter sawn. So if you can look at the annual rings, where it's turning like this, right in that midsection, excuse me, if you cut that and open it up, it's going to be quarter sawn. So the quarter sawn and rift sawn, straight grain, but sometimes you'll get a bit of thicker, a little flake ray within that quarter sawn. So depending on the wood you're using, cherry really shows it, maple really shows it, but it's not necessarily a deal breaker to me. It still looks very clean, and you can always mix match them if you want. One other thing before we go and actually do this, probably overloading you with information you don't need to know right now, but this is called a slip match. It's typically what I'm going to do. So when I end up cutting these all out, I'll rotate them down and just slip them out. And so it's not a book match. Book match is when you open it up. The thing with doing the book match is when the light hits it, it reflects differently, so it can look very different. The color can actually look different, even though it's from the same piece. So slip matching it, the light is going to reflect the same throughout the whole piece, so at least the color is going to look the same. So the other thing with this design, I try to do it thoughtfully where most of the material will come out of the edge of the board, with the exception of this one rail. So this is the bottom rail, which is a little bit wider. The reason I like to get it out of the edge is because I like straight grain. So these guys just came right out the edge and they're nice and straight. But obviously this one would be too wide. So for that, you'll try to find a piece of either 4/4 if you have it, or you could actually just rip it out, out of a chunk like this and get that nice straight grain. Now all of this, again, don't overthink it too much, but if you just put a little bit of thoughtful time into the grain selection, it does make a big difference. But the main thing is have fun with this, and you know, maybe this is your first project, so you may want to use poplar. It's up to you. With that, you'll end up with these very, very beautiful, very flat panels that you're going to create your sides out of. So I'm going to head over to the bandsaw, set it up. I've already addressed this edge to start with on the joiner, and then we're just going to go ahead and rip them out until I have enough to get my actual piece, which is about 11 inches. So make it a little wider than you need. This is a lot wider. It's just what it worked out to be. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 6 pieces. So if I go and just rip 6 pieces, that's going to give me one side. So like I mentioned before, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to rip this board out on the bandsaw. Now, you could do this on the table saw. I'm really more of a fan of roughing out on the bandsaw for a few reasons. One, it yields better. It doesn't seem like a lot, but you probably get an extra 1/16 worth out of this for every one you cut instead of using like an 1/8 inch or 3/32 blade on the table saw. And the main reason too is the tension. When you go to rip on the table saw, it just wants to throw it at you, it wants to pinch and do all kinds of things. The bandsaw just works very differently. The force is down, it's not trying to throw it at you. So it's kind of the go-to. In most studio shops, they're going to use bandsaws to rough out. So again, it's an 1/8 inch thicker than it needs to be. That should give us plenty to clean up. You'll notice when we do this, we won't do anything else to these parts. So I have the bandsaw mark still on it, and we'll glue it up as a panel like that. And in that way, we have that 1/8 inch to be able to join and plane the entire piece after that glue is set. So I'll get this guy set up. I'm pointing, the tooth that's pointed towards the fence, I'm going to get it at 7/8 of an inch. And if you'd be more comfortable going a little heavier, that's up to you too. All right, so one thing I kind of want to point out is this what I was mentioning before. So when you rip material, that's when it wants to move. And where the common sense comes in is, I teach a lot, and typically it's 1/8 inches enough. And then a student will go do it, and I'll come over, and it's just warped and crazy, and that piece won't make. But they say you said an 1/8 inch. So this is what I'm usually looking at. As you can see, those boards, it just goes straight back together. So there's not a lot of tension in this piece. Now, if you ended up doing it and there's like this huge bow, the ends are touching and there's a big old gap in the middle, you need to adjust that. So this should be enough for what I need. If you are doing this, one step I didn't do is a lot of times I will mark the end with like a triangle, and basically that tells me how this piece goes back together. So when I end up, slip matching it, it's right and things are not mixed up. So not that big of a deal, but it does help with certain things. So we'll go back to the bench, get this laid out, talk a little bit about addressing the edges. So the edges still need to be squared to each other. We'll do the whole in-out technique on the joiner, and I'll explain why that's important, and then get this guy glued up. So now that we have our parts, of course it's just for one side. We need to make a couple of determinations how we want it to look. So I'm just going to lay it out. This was the triangle I was talking about, so that tells me exactly how this piece comes back together. And so a slip match is just simply rotating them over. And that way, I get a really nice straight grain looking panel instead of book matching them open, which if you did the book match, it'd be more like this, which is really nice because you have that mirror image, but it can reflect that light pretty different and look a little odd sometimes. So for this, slip match works really well. even though that looks pretty tight together, it still needs to be joined because none of these edges are true at the moment. And so I'm just gonna go ahead, put my little triangle. That's the way I want this piece to go together. And then this seems a little time consuming, but it really is important. I'm basically gonna put on each edge that's gonna go across the joiner, I'm gonna put an I and an O. And the reason for that is when you go to the joiner, like most things in woodworking, you want to be perfect, but it's all about little, variations of variables that kind of throws things off. So you try to eliminate as much as you can. And this is one of those things where, yes, you're going to check your joiner, make sure it's square. But then if you do in, out, even if your joiner's a little bit out of square, it's not going to, it's basically compensating. So instead of it just doing this, where you're going to have these two board edges go together, and then it's going to end up basically making this as a camber, especially with all these pieces, you could end up with something like this. Instead, it's going to end up complementing each other, if that makes sense. So one face of this is in, the other face is out. So the IO is in, out in relation to the actual fence. So when we go over to the joiner, you'll see me doing that. And that should give us a really nice flat panel to start out with. So got that done. This looks good. So really now it's just going to the joiner and just skimming across this and getting this ready for glue up. I'm just going to check it for square. And that looks pretty good. And so now it's just the I and the O. So this is going to be in towards the fence, and then the O, where this one meets, will be out, and then in, out, in, out. So that's what that's about. So let's just do it. As you can see, the panel came out really nice. I just want to point out a couple of things about the joiner, because the joiner can be a really frustrating machine if it's not set right. So these two things will probably help you out if you're having some trouble. So what I'm looking for is when I come back to the table like this, if I push down at the end here, it's not opening up, at this end, or vice versa. And if it is, that means you're basically, your outfeed table is too low. You've got snipe that's happening. That's one of the reasons. That or your outfeed table is too high. So as confusing as that sounds, here's a couple of ways you can tell what's going on. So really just filling the piece. And it should be just flat all the way across. There should not be a little drop at the ends. And so what can happen, and I'll try to show this here, this is kind of an exaggeration on it. On the tailing end of it, so as you go for the joint and you're coming onto the outfeed table, which is, the outfeed table is where your concentration really should be. Once you get on that, that's the concentration, not the infeed, because you can end up rocking that piece through. But on the tail end, that's a huge exaggeration. If it's doing that, what's happening is as it goes through, and it leaves that infeed table, it drops down because the outfeed table is too low in relationship, not with the infeed table, but in relationship with the actual cutter head itself. And so that's really easy to just adjust that. You've got to come up with that outfeed table. Now, we're going to do a whole nother video really going into that, me showing you setting up straight knives and also explaining how you can check that very easily. The other thing, which is probably the worst thing, because this gets people really confused, the telltale sign for me is when I'm teaching a class and I see someone at the joiner, this edge is nice and clean, but they've been at that joiner with that same piece for 20 minutes and they just keep going. What's happening is they end up joining it, they come down to a flat surface and it's rocking. And so they just keep going because they don't know what's wrong. And what typically happens is if you're cleaning it, no snipe or anything, you're cleaning it, but it's rocking on your outfeed table, it's bowed. What's happening is the outfeed table is too high. And so just by a few thousandths. So as it leaves the infeed and goes to the outfeed, it actually picks it up just a little bit. And then it cuts off more at the back side. So you just keep on doing the same thing again and again. So If you're having those issues, you know, we'll definitely do a video which may be helpful to you to try to eliminate some of those issues with your joiner. But this is what you want. I'm not getting into spring joints and you know, leaving a gap in the middle. If I can come off the joiner and it's this good, this thing's going to glue up perfectly without really any stress. So this looks really nice. It's nice and flat going across. Yes, my reference face was a bandsaw mark, was a bandsaw face. It's consistent enough that it works just fine. You don't have to take each one of these, join it, plane it, then join it. That just takes too much time. So these are still heavy. When we glue this up, we try to keep it as flat as possible. Keeping in mind we have a whole 1/8 inch to get this thing to final measurement. So now I'm going to go ahead, take this over to my sawhorses. We're going to glue out, get some blue tape and clamps, make sure we're all ready for that, and get this guy glued up. So ready for glue up, you know, it's always important to just make sure you got everything you need right away, even though this is a very simple glue up. But I've got 3 clamps, so it'll be 2 under, 1 above. Obviously got my piece that I need to glue up. Got my glue, my blue tape, a little scraper and a scrap piece of wood. So the blue tape will go down on the clamps, and that way it stops the glue from getting on the clamps. And these clamps I don't think actually oxidize with the wood and the glue, but the iron clamps that I have in the background, if you don't put blue tape on those and that glue, that moisture basically reacts with the wood and the steel, it will destroy it. It can like penetrate very deep, and I learned the hard way about that. So it's just a good method to use some blue tape on this. So real quick, I'm going to lay this back out so I can establish the length of my tape. Another thing, so this is just a pet peeve for me. It drives me absolutely crazy when people just go and they put a big old strip on there and then they put it on their clamp, and when you clamp it up, that tape actually gets up underneath the actual bar itself, and it can be really difficult to get out. So, you know, you don't need much on there. And you see, these are little weird things that I have, but it's not a Christmas present, right? You don't need to be bending it over and creasing it over. I just like to put it on like that, because then later on it just peels off real quick and I'm not spending 20 minutes picking off the tape because I just pushed it all over the sides. Take one of these, put it to the side. So the type glue I'm using is just regular, you know, type 1, Taiwan. Doesn't need to be anything more than that. If you want a little bit of a slower set, you can use the type 2, but my shop's it's climatized, so there's no rush here, I've got time. So I'll glue both meat and surfaces. You could use a brush for this if you want. It seems like it just takes too much time when people brush it. And my finger is always with me, so there's that. All right. So the big thing when you're gluing up something like this, people get stressed out with is they rush it and they want to get those clamps on and put as much pressure as possible straight away, and everything's slipping and moving around. So typically I'm pretty chill about it. I'm just going to apply a little bit of pressure, and once those surfaces are just, you know, tacking together just for like a few seconds, 30 seconds or so, they don't want to move. It's kind of amazing. So I just build that pressure up slowly, and as I'm doing that, I'm also checking to make sure things are not getting too out of whack this way. But we do have an 1/8, but try to keep it as flat as possible. And I'm just building that pressure up. You can see the glue squeeze out. And if they're slipping a little bit this way, it's oversized, so I'm not too concerned about that. I like to just get rid of the glue straight away, instead of having to scrape it later on. So now I'll start clamping down on it a little bit more. So you see how now that I can just really go to town on it, it's not moving, it's there. All right, looks good, looks flat, and that's that in out. You know, if you didn't do that in out, and if you're just a hair out of square on that joiner, you can put your thing over, your straight edge over, and it's got this big old crown on it. So this is what you want, nice and flat. I'll leave this in the clamps, and I try to tighten it as tight as I can get it. You're not going to starve the joint and stuff. It's just going to stay together. But the important thing is to plan this ahead so you can get this done, get your panels glued up, and then you can move on with milling your other rails out whilst this stuff is drying. And I won't touch this for probably 24 hours until I join and plane it. The risk is if you just leave it for 4 hours or so and you try to join and plane, put finish on it, you know, get it all done, these seams will actually move because we've just added water to this. So just leave it as long as you can. 24 hours should be plenty. All right, there it is.